The first thing people noticed when they drove past Rebecca Carter's property on County Road F was the rust. It stretched across 3 acres behind her repair shop, row after row of old tractors sitting in the tall grass. Oxidized orange and brown under the Iowa sky, John Deeres from the 1950s and 60s, International harvester machines that hadn't run in decades, disassembled engines arranged on wooden pallets along the fence line, transmission housing stacked near the back barn, steel wheels, fuel tanks, cracked rubber hoses hanging from nails on the shop wall. To anyone driving past on a Tuesday morning, it looked exactly like what they'd always called it: junk. Becky Carter was 47 years old in 1999, and she had been listening to people call her property junk for most of her adult life. She had developed a particular kind of patience about it, the kind that comes not from ignoring criticism, but from understanding something the critic doesn't. She never argued. She never explained herself at the hardware store or at the grain elevator. When someone made a comment about her yard at the diner on Main Street, she'd nod slightly, finish her coffee, and leave a tip on the counter. She had learned that from her father. Thomas Carter had run the same repair shop for 31 years before his heart gave out in the spring of 1994. He had been a quiet man, heavy-set, oil-stained hands, a way of listening to an engine that reminded people of a doctor listening to a chest. Farmers drove from 3 counties away to have Thomas look at a machine nobody else could figure out. He never advertised. He never needed to. What Thomas left Becky when he died wasn't much on paper. The shop building, the property, a rusted-out Ford pickup, and somewhere around $40,000 in unpaid repair invoices that she knew she'd never collect. But he also left her something else, something most people who came to pay their respects at the funeral never thought to ask about: 14 spiral-bound notebooks filled front to back in his careful, cramped handwriting. Jake Miller bought the farm adjacent to Becky's property in the spring of 1990. He was 35, recently married and confident in the way young men are when they've done well enough quickly enough that they haven't yet learned what they don't know. He ran a clean operation. New John Deere 8000 series tractor, precision planting equipment. He had taken an agricultural technology course at Iowa State and believed, as many farmers his age did, that the future of farming was in computers and efficiency. The old ways were the old ways for a reason. His first real conversation with Becky happened over a fence line dispute about a drainage ditch in early fall of 1998. It was polite enough. But afterward, standing back in his driveway and looking across at her yard, he said something to his wife that he would later remember with some embarrassment. "She's out there in a junkyard thinking she's running a business." He meant it the way most of the neighbors meant it, not cruelly, just practically. There were about a dozen farms within 2 miles of Becky's shop, and the general opinion was consistent. The yard was an eyesore. The county had received at least 2 complaints about it over the years, though nothing formal had ever been filed. The farmers around her had moved steadily into newer equipment through the 1990s. Computerized planting systems, GPAs, guided field management. The conversation at every farm show was always about what was coming next. Nobody was talking about what was being left behind. Mark Reynolds had noticed this too, but from a very different angle. Reynolds ran a scrap operation out of a facility near Waterloo, and he drove County Road F regularly on his way to visit clients. He had been watching Becky's yard for about 2 years before he finally stopped in the fall of 1998. He was friendly about it, offered her coffee from his thermos, stood in the gravel driveway doing the math in his head. 40, maybe 50 machines at current scrap prices, plus the loose components in the engine blocks. "I could give you a fair number," he said. Becky was wiping her hands on a shop rag. She looked out at the yard the way you'd look at a room in your house that was being offered as a parking lot. "I appreciate you stopping," she said. But no. Reynolds tried twice more over the following year. Each time she thanked him and declined. He eventually stopped coming, which was its own kind of judgment. A man who makes his living buying things other people don't want had decided she wasn't worth the trip. What almost nobody in Hartfield County understood about Becky Carter was that her yard was not neglected, it was organized. Not in a way that was immediately obvious. The grass grew long between the rows because mowing between old tractor frames was not practical, and she had made a decision early on that appearances were not the point. But if you walked the property with her, which almost no one ever had, you would notice things. Every machine had a metal tag wired to the steering column with a number stamped into it. The numbers corresponded to a ledger she kept on a shelf above her workbench, updated in pencil. Year, model, engine type, what was intact, what was missing, what needed documentation. She had been adding to that ledger since her father was still alive. Thomas Carter had started the collection almost by accident in the late 1960s, when a farmer paid off a repair bill by signing over an old 1952 John Deere Model R that had thrown a connecting rod and wasn't worth fixing. Thomas repaired it, ran it for a season in his own small field, then retired it to the back of the property when it blew a head gasket. He kept it because he thought he might fix it someday, and because he understood instinctively that every machine ever made eventually becomes a donor for another machine of the same kind. That original logic had grown over 30 years into something much more considered. By the time Thomas handed the shop over to Becky in the early 1990s, the yard contained machines spanning 4 decades of American agricultural equipment. Farmall M tractors from the late 1940s, a pair of John Deere 4020s that had been the workhorses of half the county in their day, an Oliver 88 with a cracked block, kept not for its engine, but for its transmission housing, which Thomas had noted in his records as interchangeable with 3 other models that were still running on farms in the area. Thomas had understood something about manufacturing that most people only learn by losing something they needed. Manufacturers don't discontinue a machine and then keep making all the parts forever. They wind down parts production gradually, usually within 10 to 15 years of a model going out of production. Some parts lasted longer, common gaskets, bearings, basic hardware, but the specialized castings, the proprietary governor assemblies, the specific carburetor float valves for an engine that ran 4 million hours across a generation of Iowa farms, those were already disappearing from dealership shelves by the late 1980s. By the mid-1990s, some of them were simply gone. Thomas had seen it coming before anyone in Hartfield County was paying attention. Becky had watched him see it, and then she had learned to see it herself. The notebooks were the real education. Each one covered a specific period and a specific set of machines. Thomas hadn't written them as manuals. They weren't step-by-step repair guides. They were more like field notes from a man who had spent 3 decades solving problems that manufacturers never anticipated. Notes on which parts from a John Deere 4020 would cross-reference to a 3020 under certain conditions. Notes on rebuilding carburetor float valves from raw brass stock when the factory part was unavailable. Notes on stress fracture patterns in specific transmission housings and how to identify early failure before it became catastrophic. Long, careful lists of part numbers with notations about when Thomas had last seen them available through a dealer and what the alternative sources had been. He had updated some of these lists as recently as 6 months before he died. Becky had read every notebook twice within a year of his death. She read them again in the evenings through the long Iowa winters, usually with a cup of tea and the shop heater running, not because she had memorized everything, nobody could have, but because the information kept connecting to things she was seeing in the yard and to questions farmers were already beginning to ask. A farmer would call about a part for a machine he'd kept running because he trusted it or because replacing it wasn't in the budget, or simply because a well-maintained older tractor did the job he needed and he didn't see the logic in buying new. Consult the ledger, and most of the time find what she was looking for. Sometimes she found the exact part. Sometimes she found a donor machine that could yield what was needed with some shop work. She rarely advertised this. She didn't need to. Word moved the way it always moves in small farming communities. Slowly, person to person, around the edges of conversations at the elevator and after church. The pressure had been building through the late 1990s, though Becky had been quiet enough about her finances that few people understood just how close the margins actually were. The property tax bill on 3 acres of rural Iowa wasn't significant by any urban standard, but the repair shop itself ran on thin money. Farming communities in the late 1990s were under real strain. Commodity prices were difficult. Farmers were watching budgets carefully, and some of the repair work that might have come her way was going to larger dealers with newer equipment and financing arrangements. Her shop was built for older machines. That was the only kind of work she'd ever really known. And in 1999, that market was officially considered to be shrinking. Her banker, a careful man named Doyle Hendricks, sat across from her at the First Agricultural Bank of Hartfield in March of 1999 and asked her, gently but directly, whether she had considered liquidating the yard to reduce her overhead. "The scrap market isn't bad right now," he said. "That Reynolds fellow buys in volume." "I know he does," Becky said. Doyle looked at his papers. "You're current on everything. I'm not saying there's a problem. I'm saying there might be a better use of the property." "I appreciate the advice," Becky said. "I'm going to keep the yard." Doyle Hendricks wrote a note in her file that said something like "client has unconventional approach to asset management," and let it go. But the meeting made the rounds the way things do in small towns. By April, Jake Miller had heard a version of it at the co-op, and the version he heard was that Becky Carter was in financial trouble because she refused to sell her junkyard. He drove past her property on the way home that evening and looked at the rows of old machines and shook his head. He genuinely couldn't understand it. The call that changed everything came on a Tuesday morning in late June of 2001. A farmer named Dennis Voss ran about 800 acres east of Hartfield and had kept a John Deere 4020 in service for general farm work even after upgrading his primary equipment. The 4020 was a 1968 model, and Voss had maintained it carefully for 30 years. It ran well. He used it for loader work, for pulling equipment around the yard, for jobs where he didn't need GPA's guidance and didn't want to put hours on his newer machine. In late June, the hydraulic pump on the 4020 failed. Not the pump itself. The pump drive shaft, a specific internal component that transmitted power from the engine to the hydraulic system. It had cracked under metal fatigue in a way that couldn't be welded or fabricated without specialized tooling. Voss called his John Deere dealer first. The dealer looked it up in the system and told him what the system told him: not available, discontinued, had been for some years. They could try to source it from a parts network, but nobody made any promises. Voss spent the better part of a week making calls: a parts broker in Des Moines, 2 dealers in neighboring counties, an agricultural salvage operation in Nebraska that specialized in older John Deere machines. The Nebraska outfit didn't have the specific shaft for a 1968 pump configuration. They had parts for the later hydraulic system revision, but the 4020 went through 2 different hydraulic pump designs across its production run, and Voss had the early version. Nobody had what he needed. His 3rd week of calling brought him, through a chain of 3 separate referrals, to Becky Carter's shop on County Road F. He drove over on a Wednesday afternoon. He passed her property dozens of times and had always thought roughly what everyone else thought. He pulled into the gravel drive not particularly hopeful and found her in the shop doing brake work on a neighbor's pickup. He explained the problem. She listened without interrupting. When he finished, she said, "What month of 1968? He looked at her. "The serial number puts it at March." She nodded once and walked out the side door into the yard. He followed her past 2 rows of machines to a 4020 sitting near the back fence. She opened the sheet metal access panel on the hydraulic system side, looked at the pump configuration, and then looked at the ledger card she'd carried out from the shop. "This one's got the same setup," she said. "Early pump. The shaft should be good. This machine came in with a different failure. She had the part out in under 2 hours. She cleaned it, measured it against a specification she pulled from one of her father's notebooks, and handed it to Voss with a handwritten invoice for parts and labor. Voss stood in the driveway for a moment before he got in his truck. "How did you know you had that?" he said. "Because I know what's in the yard," she said. He drove home, installed the part with help from his son, and his 4020 ran the rest of the season without a problem. He called Becky in September to tell her. Then he mentioned it to 2 other farmers at the elevator. It did not happen all at once. That's not how things happen in farming communities, and Becky wouldn't have wanted it to. But through the fall of 2001 and into the following spring, something that had been quiet and occasional became steadily more regular. A farmer named Carroll had an I-Farmall M with a governor that was hunting badly, surging and dropping instead of holding a steady RME. The original governor assembly was no longer available through any supplier he could find. He'd been told by 2 mechanics to either swap in a different engine or retire the machine. Becky had a parts M in the yard that she'd acquired specifically for its intact drivetrain and governor assembly. She spent an afternoon pulling the governor, comparing it against the notes in Thomas's notebook on Farmall governor specifications, and rebuilt it with components from 2 machines combined. Carroll's M ran evenly again for the first time in 3 years. Then there was a farmer named Schultz who needed a specific crankshaft seal for a late 1960s E-engine, not a standard size. A seal that had been superseded by a different design in a later engine revision, and for which the original dimension was no longer listed in any current catalog. Becky found the specification in her father's notes. Thomas had encountered the same problem in 1981 and had written down the cross-reference to an industrial seal that shared the same dimensions. The industrial seal was still being manufactured. Nobody else in the county would have known to look for it. Each solved problem added to the pattern, and the pattern was becoming difficult to ignore. Laura Bennett arrived in the spring of 2002. She was an agricultural equipment historian connected to Iowa State University's extension program, and she had been working for 2 years on a project documenting what she called the institutional knowledge gap in rural equipment preservation, the growing distance between the mechanical knowledge that older farm mechanics carried and the industry's move toward electronic diagnostics and proprietary systems that required dealer-level equipment to service. She had heard about Becky's operation through a colleague in the agricultural engineering department who had spoken to Dennis Voss at a Farm Bureau meeting. The description she'd been given was something like, "There's a woman in Hartfield County with a salvage yard full of old tractors and her father's repair notebooks, and farmers are starting to drive from pretty far away to see her." Bennett drove out on a gray April morning and spent 4 hours walking the yard with Becky, who answered questions without embellishment and pulled ledger cards to show how the collection was organized. What Bennett saw was not what she had expected. She had expected a salvage yard, useful, practical, but essentially reactive. What she found was something closer to a working archive. The machines were organized not by type or age, but by mechanical system and cross-compatibility. The ledger didn't just record what was present, it recorded relationships between machines, which components from one model could serve another, which systems shared common failure patterns, which parts had been pulled and used and needed to be noted as depleted. "Your father started this system?" Bennett asked. "He started the yard," Becky said. "I built the ledger." "When did you start the ledger?" "While he was still alive. He'd tell me something about a machine and I'd write it down. After he died, I went back through his notebooks and cross-referenced everything he'd written with what was actually in the yard. The engine was intact. "Do you know what you have here?" she said. Becky looked at her carefully. "I think so," she said. "There are extension agents in this state who've been trying to compile part cross-reference data for machines in this production range for 2 years, Bennett said. "We keep running into the same wall. The knowledge existed in the heads of mechanics who've retired or passed away, and it was never systematically recorded." Becky said nothing for a moment. Then she went inside and came back with a spiral notebook. She handed it to Bennett. "That's number 7, she said. "It covers I engines from 1958 to 1972. If you want to see the rest, I'll make coffee." Jake Miller heard about the university visit from his wife, who had heard about it from the postmaster. He drove past Becky's yard that evening, on the way back from checking his own fields, and noticed a state university vehicle still parked in the gravel lot. He slowed down without fully stopping. Something about the sight stayed with him. He'd had his own equipment trouble that spring, not with old machines, but with a newer GP's guidance system that required a dealer technician to recalibrate. The dealer was backed up 6 days, and 6 days was 6 days during planting season. He'd eventually borrowed a neighbor's older equipment to finish the field rather than wait. He hadn't thought much of it at the time. But driving past Becky's yard that evening, watching the light in her shop window and the university car in the drive, he found himself thinking about it again. He stopped by the following Saturday morning. Becky was at the workbench when he knocked on the open shop door. She looked up and gave him the kind of nod that holds no grudge and asks for no acknowledgement of anything that's passed between two neighbors. "I wanted to ask you something," Jake said. "All right. The 4020 Dennis Voss has. I heard you found a part for it that nobody else could. Found it in the yard," she said. "Same pump configuration." He looked around the shop, at the notebooks on the shelf, at the ledger hanging on its nail by the door, at the hand-drawn diagram of a carburetor float assembly tacked to the wall next to a coffee-ringed mug that looked like it had been there since the 1980s. "How long did it take your father to learn all this?" he said. Becky set down her wrench and thought about it genuinely, the way she thought about everything. "He'd say he never stopped learning it," she said. "That was kind of the point." Jake looked out the shop window at the yard. The morning light was hitting the old machines in a way that made the rust look almost like something aged on purpose. "I owe you an apology," he said. "You don't," she said. "You thought what made sense to think." She handed him a coffee and walked him out into the yard. The summer of 2002 brought more farmers. Some drove more than an hour. Word had moved through the network the way useful information always moves in farming country, not through advertising, not through any announcement, but through the mouth of one farmer to another standing at the back of a pickup truck. The message was always roughly the same. If you've got an old machine and a part problem nobody can solve, go see Becky Carter on County Road F. Not everything had a solution. She was clear about that. Some machines were too far gone. Some parts she didn't have and couldn't fabricate. Some problems required tooling she didn't own. She turned those away honestly, sometimes with a suggestion of who else might help, and never let people leave thinking they'd found a miracle shop because she wasn't running one. But enough had solutions that the reputation held. Laura Bennett came back 3 more times that summer, and by fall she had formally proposed a documentation project through the University Extension Program. The goal was to transcribe and digitize Thomas Carter's 14 notebooks, cross-reference the part data with surviving equipment records, and create an accessible resource for mechanics and farmers working with older machinery across the state. Becky agreed to participate on one condition. The physical originals stayed with her. Bennett agreed without hesitation. The project moved slowly the way academic projects do. But by the following year, the transcription work was underway, and Becky found herself sitting at a table 2 evenings a week with a graduate student named Phil Ogden, who typed while she read aloud from the notebooks and added context from memory. Things her father had told her in the shop that he'd never written down, clarifications on handwritten abbreviations, corrections to specs he'd updated in later notebooks and never gone back to revise. Thomas Carter's 40 years of field knowledge was being written into a form that could outlast both of them. Mark Reynolds came by one more time in the fall of 2002. He had heard things. Enough that he made the drive out of curiosity. He pulled into the driveway on a Wednesday and found 2 farm pickups already parked in the gravel and Becky at a workbench with a farmer from 2 counties over, who was holding an hydraulic valve body in both hands while Becky showed him something in a notebook. Reynolds stood in the doorway for a moment and looked around the shop. He was a practical man. He saw things in terms of value, and he understood that he had misjudged the value here, not the metal. The metal would have been worth about what he'd figured. He'd misjudged the other thing. The thing that made the metal worth more than its weight. He bought a cup of coffee from the pot on the counter and left without making an offer. Becky never mentioned his visits to anyone. Jake Miller worked alongside Becky through 2 harvest seasons before he began to fully understand what she'd built. It wasn't the parts, that was the surface of it. It was the system. The way knowledge about one machine connected to another, the way understanding the original design logic of a 1955 tractor engine could help you diagnose a problem in a 1968 engine that shared the same basic architecture. Farmers and mechanics spent years developing that kind of understanding, and it lived in them, and then it died with them, unless someone deliberately caught it before it fell. That was what Thomas Carter had done. That was what Becky had continued. One evening in late October, with the harvest mostly done and the fields turning brown, Jake sat in the shop while Becky cleaned a set of valve covers from a disassembled engine. "My grandfather had a farm all hayed," he said. "My dad sold it for scrap in 1982, said it was taking up room." "Lot of those went that way," she said. "I think about that sometimes." She set down the valve cover and looked at him directly. "You know what your grandfather knew about that machine?" "He didn't." "That's the part nobody thinks about," she said. She wasn't being unkind. She was describing a fact of the world, one she'd been watching her whole life. The machines disappeared, and the knowledge about them disappeared too, and the disappearing was so gradual that by the time people noticed the loss, most of what was gone was already unreachable. Jake sat with that for a while. By 2003, the documentation project had produced its first working reference guide. It covered engine specifications, part cross-references, and known failure patterns for 12 tractor models manufactured between 1948 and 1971. The guide listed Thomas Carter as primary source and credited Becky Carter for additional documentation and field verification. The university wanted to do a formal recognition event. Becky declined. She accepted a letter of appreciation and asked that any follow-up materials be directed through the extension office. The yard was still there, still organized, still growing slowly as machines came in from farmers who understood now what she was doing and wanted their old equipment to serve one more purpose. Jake Miller sent her a 1961 E560 that had come with a farm he bought. He could have sold it for scrap. He didn't. He had it towed to County Road F, tagged it himself with a number in pencil, and left it at the end of the back row with a note clipped to the steering wheel that said, "Don't know what's useful in her. Figured you'd know better than me." Becky read the note in the yard that morning, folded it once, and put it in her jacket pocket. She walked the machine slowly, lifting panels, checking the engine, checking the transmission housing. The loader linkage was intact. The hydraulic system was a configuration she had two other machines in common with. The engine had a cracked block, which made it a part stoner, and the front axle assembly appeared to be in good shape, a component she'd noted in the ledger 3 months earlier as something she needed. She pulled out her ledger card and started writing. The light was coming through the trees at the east end of the property, long and low and gold, the way Iowa light gets in early fall. The old machines stood in their rows the way they always had, holding their ground quietly, waiting to be useful in whatever way was still possible. Becky Carter stood among them with a pencil in her hand and her father's knowledge in her head and wrote down what she found. It was exactly what she'd always done. It was exactly enough.